Imagine a divided kingdom where brothers fight against brothers and the throne is bathed in blood. 12th century Norway was not just a land of fjords and northern lights, but a battlefield where unbridled ambitions and treacherous alliances shaped the destiny of a nation. This marks the beginning of the Norwegian Civil Wars, one of the darkest and most fascinating periods of medieval history. After the death of King Sigurd the Crusader in 1130, Norway plunged into chaos that would last more than a century. Pretenders to the throne emerged from all sides, and what began as family disputes soon transformed into bloody civil wars. But what led to this? Who were the protagonists of these conflicts, and how did the country finally find peace? The story begins with King Sigurd, a powerful ruler who had brought stability to Norway through his crusades and military prowess. But his death created a power vacuum that would tear the country apart. What many don't know is that Sigurd himself suffered from periodic bouts of madness in his later years, which had already begun to weaken the kingdom's stability before his death. When Sigurd died, multiple claimants emerged, some legitimate heirs, others mere opportunists. Family ties meant little as cousins, uncles, and nephews turned against each other in a ruthless scramble for power. The Norwegian landscape, with its harsh mountains and deep fjords, became the perfect setting for ambushes, sieges, and battles that would rage for generations. In the early decades, alliances shifted as frequently as the northern winds. A warrior might pledge loyalty to one pretender in the morning and betray him by nightfall. The common people suffered tremendously, caught between warring factions that demanded their loyalty, their resources, and often their lives. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we journey through one of Europe's longest civil wars and discover how a nation torn apart by ambition eventually found its path to unity. It all began with the death of Sigurd the Crusader in 1130, a king who had consolidated power in Norway through military might and diplomatic cunning. Sigurd had earned his epithet the Crusader after becoming the first European king to personally lead a crusade to the Holy Land. He had returned to Norway with exotic treasures, prestigious alliances, and a fragment of the True Cross, a relic that bolstered both his political standing and his reputation as a defender of Christianity. But beneath this glorious facade, Sigurd's final years were marked by increasing mental instability. Contemporary accounts describe episodes where he would stare into the fire for hours, throw plates at his servants, or fail to recognize his closest advisors. When he finally died, he left behind not just a kingdom, but a perfect storm for conflict. Immediately, a power vacuum formed that would suck Norway into chaos. His son Magnus, born to his queen, claimed the throne as the legitimate heir. But there was a problem. Sigurd's illegitimate son, Harald Gille, who had arrived from Ireland years earlier, also stepped forward with claims to royal blood. What's particularly fascinating is that Harald had initially sworn on holy relics that he would never seek the crown during Sigurd's lifetime, a cleverly worded oath that became meaningless the moment the king drew his last breath. The Norwegian aristocracy quickly split into factions, seeing an opportunity to increase their own power by backing different claimants. Magnus had the advantage of legitimacy, but Harald possessed charm and charisma that won him many supporters. The stage was set for bloodshed. In the first decades following Sigurd's death, alliances shifted as rapidly as the seasons in the north. One day, two men might share mead and swear eternal brotherhood. The next, they would be mortal enemies, plotting each other's demise. Blood ties meant little when the crown was at stake. A Norse chronicle from the time tells us that brother fought brother and father fought son, and oaths were broken like dry twigs in winter. The common people suffered terribly during this time. Each new claimant demanded taxes and military service, often from the same communities that had just paid tribute to a rival. Fields went unharvested as farmers were conscripted into warring armies, leading to widespread famine in some regions. Towns that supported the wrong side could be put to the torch, with inhabitants enslaved or slaughtered. What makes this period particularly complex is that there was no clear villain or hero. Each faction believed in the righteousness of their cause, and each claimant had some legitimate basis for their claims. The Norwegian succession laws were ambiguous, allowing any man of royal blood, legitimate or otherwise, to be considered for kingship if he could gather enough support. This legal ambiguity turned political disagreements into existential struggles, where compromise seemed impossible and total victory the only option. By the late 12th century, the chaotic free-for-all of Norway's civil wars had crystallized into something more defined. Two major factions emerged as the principal protagonists in this national drama: the Baglers and the Birkebeiners. The Baglers, whose name derives from the Old Norse word bagal, meaning a bishop's staff, represented the traditional power structure. They were backed by the church, the old nobility, and the merchant class of the coastal towns. Archbishop Eystein of Nidaros, a formidable political figure, lent them not just spiritual authority, but also the considerable wealth of the church. The Baglers claimed to fight for tradition, order, and the established succession laws. They had fine weapons, wore expensive armor, and had access to international networks through the church's connections across Europe. In stark contrast stood the Birkebeiners, whose name tells its own fascinating story. They were called birch-legs because, in their early days as a ragtag band of rebels, they were so poor that they had to wrap their legs in birch bark instead of wearing proper leather boots. What began as a derogatory nickname became a badge of honor, symbolizing their humble origins and fierce determination. The Birkebeiners were a motley crew of farmers, outcasts, and disaffected warriors who rallied behind charismatic leaders who promised a different vision for Norway. Chief among these leaders was Sverre Sigurdsson, perhaps the most remarkable figure of the entire Civil War period. Sverre claimed to be the illegitimate son of a former king, though many doubted his lineage. What's truly extraordinary about Sverre is that he was raised to be a priest on the remote Faroe Islands, far from the Norwegian mainland. He was already in his 30s when he abandoned his clerical path to pursue his claim to the throne. Sverre was no typical warrior. He was short in stature, well-educated, and a masterful orator who could inspire loyalty in his followers, even in the bleakest circumstances. When he first arrived in Norway with a band of just 70 men, most observers thought his cause was hopeless. Yet through brilliant guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, and an uncanny ability to escape seemingly impossible situations, he transformed the Birkebeiners from a desperate band of outlaws into a formidable fighting force. What makes this conflict so compelling is that it transcended the usual power struggles of medieval Europe. This wasn't just about competing claims to a throne. It evolved into something akin to a class struggle. The Birkebeiners portrayed themselves as champions of the common Norwegian, fighting against foreign influence and aristocratic privilege. They promised a more equitable distribution of power and wealth, with a king who would truly represent the interests of ordinary people. The Baglers, meanwhile, painted the Birkebeiners as dangerous radicals who threatened to overturn the divine order of society. They had the Pope himself excommunicate Sverre, declaring him an enemy of Christendom. This meant that, according to the Church, anyone who killed Sverre would be doing God's work. The conflict between these factions was not just fought on battlefields, but also in the minds and hearts of the Norwegian people. Each side produced propaganda, songs, and sagas to promote their cause. The Sverre saga, which chronicles Sverre's life and struggles, remains one of the most important literary works of medieval Scandinavia, a testament to how this conflict shaped not just Norway's political landscape but its cultural identity as well. The Norwegian Civil Wars were not a single, continuous conflict, but rather a series of brutal campaigns punctuated by brief, uneasy truces. The struggle between the Baglers and Birkebeiners produced some of the most dramatic battles and unexpected reversals of fortune in medieval Scandinavian history. Perhaps the most legendary of these confrontations took place at the Battle of Fimreit in 1184. King Sverre Sigurdsson, leading his outnumbered Birkebeiner forces, faced off against King Magnus Erlingsson and the Bagler fleet on the narrow Sognefjord. Magnus had more ships, more men, and the backing of the church. Victory seemed assured for the Bagler cause. But Sverre was a master tactician who understood the psychology of battle as well as its physical dimensions. He deliberately positioned his smaller ships to draw Magnus's larger vessels into the narrowest part of the fjord. Once there, the Bagler ships became so tightly packed that their crews could barely move or fight effectively. The Birkebeiners seized this opportunity, boarding the crowded enemy vessels and methodically overwhelming them one by one. As the battle raged, Magnus's flagship began to sink from the weight of armored men crowding to one side of the deck. In the chaos, King Magnus himself drowned, weighed down by his heavy mail. Legend says that Sverre wept when he heard of Magnus's death, despite their bitter enmity. "Today, Norway has lost its most noble son," he reportedly said, "though God has granted me the kingdom." This victory should have secured Sverre's reign, but peace remained elusive. The Baglers, now led by Bishop Nicholas Arnason, a shrewd and ambitious man who harbored a personal hatred for Sverre, refused to accept defeat. Nicholas traveled to Denmark, securing support from the Danish king and recruiting a new army to challenge the Birkebeiners. What makes this period so fascinating is the constant shift in advantages. The Birkebeiners controlled the inland regions, where their support among farmers and common people was strongest. The Baglers dominated the coastal cities, where merchants and the church held sway. This geographical division meant that neither side could easily deliver a knockout blow. One of the most curious aspects of this conflict was how personal relationships complicated political alliances. Take the story of Inge Magnusson, a Bagler pretender to the throne who discovered that his own foster father was secretly passing information to Sverre. Rather than executing the man for treason, as would have been customary, Inge merely stripped him of his lands, unable to order the death of the man who had raised him. Such personal connections often softened the harsh edges of political necessity. The war took bizarre turns at times. During one campaign, Sverre's Birkebeiners were so desperate for food that they boiled and ate their own leather belts and shield straps to survive the winter. In another instance, a Bagler force pursued a small group of Birkebeiners onto a frozen lake, only for the ice to break beneath the weight of the heavily armored Bagler knights, sending dozens to a frigid death, while the lightly equipped Birkebeiners escaped. Each victory in this long struggle was ephemeral. When Sverre finally captured the Bagler stronghold of Bergen in 1194 after a grueling siege, he found that the Bagler leaders had escaped by ship just hours before, taking their treasure and regrouping to fight another day. The triumphant entry of Birkebeiners into the city was marred by the knowledge that the war would continue. Even Sverre's death in 1202 did not end the conflict. On his deathbed, he reportedly counseled his son Harken to seek reconciliation with the church and the Baglers, advice that went unheeded. Harken himself died just 2 years after his father, poisoned, many believed, by Bagler agents. Another sudden reversal in this seemingly endless cycle of violence. These dramatic shifts in fortune cultivated a particular kind of Norse fatalism. A Birkebeiner poem from the period captures this sentiment. Today in silk, tomorrow in the soil. Today a king, tomorrow nothing. Such is the wheel of fate that turns for all men, high and low alike. Did you know that the name Birkebeiner comes from the birch bark they wrapped around their legs to protect themselves from the cold? These weren't some fashionable leggings, this was pure survival. When you're an outlaw faction fighting against the established powers, you don't always have access to the finest leather boots or wool stockings. So these resourceful warriors improvised, using the abundant birch bark found in Norwegian forests to create makeshift leg coverings that provided some protection against the harsh Nordic winters. But while their name origin is fascinating, the most famous legend associated with the Birkebeiners happened in the winter of 1206, an event so dramatic and consequential that it has become a cornerstone of Norwegian national identity. After years of conflict, the Birkebeiner king Harken Sverresson died suddenly. Many suspect he was poisoned by Bagler sympathizers. He left behind a pregnant girlfriend, Inga of Varteig, who soon gave birth to a son named Hakon Hakonsson. This infant boy represented the future of the Birkebeiner cause, the last direct male descendant of their beloved leader Sverre. When word reached the Birkebeiners that Bagler forces were searching for the child to eliminate the threat to their power, they knew they had to act quickly. In the depths of winter, with snow blanketing the Norwegian mountains, a small group of Birkebeiner warriors arrived at Inga's farm to rescue the baby, who was just a few months old. They faced a perilous journey. The baby needed to be transported from Østerdalen to Trondheim, over 200 miles of mountainous terrain in the dead of winter, with Bagler forces patrolling the known roads and passes. The Birkebeiners selected their two strongest skiers, Torstein Skevla and Skjervald Skrukke, to carry the royal infant to safety. Picture this: two hardened warriors, skilled in battle and survival, now entrusted with the most precious cargo, a baby who could barely hold his head up. They fashioned a makeshift cradle from their shields, lined it with furs to keep the child warm, and took turns carrying him as they skied across the treacherous mountain passes of Østerdalen. A massive snowstorm struck during their journey, creating whiteout conditions that would have meant certain death for less experienced outdoorsmen. The temperature plunged, the wind howled, and visibility dropped to mere feet. Yet they pushed on, navigating by instinct and knowledge of the terrain, stopping only briefly to warm the child and give him milk they had brought in animal bladders. When supplies ran low, they melted snow in their mouths to create warm water for the baby. When one grew too exhausted to continue, the other would carry both the child and his companion until strength returned. Their determination never wavered. They knew that this small child represented the future of Norway itself. Against all odds, Torstein and Skjervald successfully delivered the infant Harken to safety in Trondheim. The child would grow up to become King Harken IV, one of Norway's greatest monarchs, who would eventually end the civil wars and establish a golden age of Norwegian prosperity and culture. The dynasty he founded would rule Norway for generations. This story of courage, endurance, and loyalty has become so iconic in Norwegian culture that it's commemorated each year in the famous Birkebeiner Rennet, a 54-kilometer cross-country ski race where participants must carry a backpack weighing 8.5 kilograms, symbolizing the weight of the infant king. The race draws thousands of participants from around the world, all retracing the desperate journey that changed the course of Norwegian history. Even Norway's national cross-country ski team is nicknamed the Birkebeiner team, keeping alive the memory of these warriors who turned their disadvantages into strengths and whose legacy extends far beyond the battlefields where they fought. So did you know that the Birkebeiners wrapped birch bark around their legs to protect themselves from the cold? If you're enjoying this video, please like, share, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more incredible stories from history. And tell us in the comments, do you think the struggle for power was worth all the bloodshed? Would you have been a Birkebeiner fighting for change, or a Bagler defending tradition? I'd love to hear your thoughts. By 1217, Norway was exhausted. Nearly a century of civil war had devastated the countryside, depleted the treasury, and left countless families mourning their dead. The once prosperous trading networks that had made Viking Age Norway wealthy were in tatters. Something had to change, and remarkably it did. The young Hakon Hakonsson, the very same baby who had been carried through the snowstorm by Birkebeiner warriors, was now a promising youth of 13. His supporters put forward his claim to the throne, arguing that, as the grandson of King Sverre, he had the strongest hereditary right to rule Norway. What's fascinating about this moment in Norwegian history is that even the Baglers, who had once tried to kill Harken as an infant, had begun to see the futility of continued conflict. The old hatreds were being replaced by a collective yearning for stability. The powerful Archbishop Guttorm of Nidaros, who had long supported the Bagler cause, now played a crucial role as mediator between the factions. At a historic meeting in Bergen, representatives of both the Birkebeiner and Bagler parties agreed to recognize Harken as the legitimate king of all Norway. This wasn't just a political compromise, it was a profound cultural shift. After generations of seeing their opponents as mortal enemies, Norwegians from both factions began the difficult work of reconciliation. Hakon proved to be exactly the king Norway needed. Despite his youth, he showed remarkable wisdom in those early years. Guided by Earl Skule Bårdsson, who served as regent until Hakon came of age. Skule was himself a powerful nobleman with a claim to the throne, having married into the royal family. For years, the arrangement worked well. Skule managed the day-to-day affairs of government while the young king learned the craft of leadership. Hakon instituted a series of reforms that strengthened royal authority while healing old wounds. He reformed the legal code, making justice more accessible to common people. He built churches and fortresses that showcased Norway's renewed prosperity. Perhaps most importantly, he established a proper royal chancellery, a bureaucratic innovation that made the Norwegian monarchy less dependent on the personal charisma of its king and more grounded in institutions that could outlast any individual ruler. By the 1230s, Norway was experiencing a renaissance. Trade flourished once more, cultural achievements multiplied, and for the first time in generations, Norwegians could plan for the future without fear of it being destroyed by civil war. But human ambition is a difficult thing to tame completely. Earl Skule, who had served as Hakon's regent and trusted advisor for years, began to harbor growing resentment. He had been the power behind the throne for so long that watching the mature Harken take full control was more than his pride could bear. Secret messengers began moving between Skule's estate and the households of discontented nobles. Old grievances were rekindled and promises were made. In 1239, the aging Earl Skule made his move. At a gathering of his supporters in Trondheim, he had himself proclaimed King of Norway. It was a desperate gamble that plunged the country back into the nightmare it thought it had escaped. Skule's rebellion gained initial momentum, capturing several key strongholds and threatening to undo all the progress of the previous decades. King Hakon responded with swift decisiveness. He rallied his forces and moved against Skule with a determination tempered by a desire to minimize bloodshed among his own people. The conflict came to a head in the spring of 1240 when Hakon's forces cornered Skule in Trondheim. Skule sought sanctuary in the Elgesita monastery, hoping that the sacred ground would protect him while he negotiated surrender terms. But Hakon's men, perhaps fearing that allowing Skule to live would only plant the seeds for future rebellion, set fire to the monastery. When Skule emerged to escape the flames, he was cut down immediately. With Skule's death, the last embers of civil war were extinguished. There would be no more pretenders, no more factions tearing Norway apart from within. After 110 years of intermittent warfare, the Norwegian Civil Wars were finally over. What followed was a golden age for medieval Norway. King Hakon, now unchallenged, would rule for another 23 years, earning the epithet Harken the Old, a term of deep respect in Norse culture. Under his leadership, Norway would reach heights of prosperity, cultural achievement, and international influence that would not be seen again for centuries. The scars of war never fully disappeared from Norway's cultural memory, but they were transformed from open wounds into lessons about the true cost of division, lessons that would shape Norwegian identity for generations to come. The century-long Norwegian Civil Wars didn't just end with a whimper, they fundamentally transformed Norway forever. Imagine a nation that had been torn apart for over 100 years, finally catching its breath. The scars run deep, but so do the lessons learned. When the final rebellion of Duke Skule Bårdsson was crushed in 1240, Norway emerged as a different country altogether. The chaotic system that had allowed ambitious nobles to constantly challenge for the throne was replaced by something far more stable. It's fascinating. Sometimes it takes a century of bloodshed to realize there might be a better way to govern. One of the most remarkable legacies was the development of a proper succession law. Before the Civil Wars, Norway operated under a system where any man who could prove royal blood could claim the throne. And yes, I do mean any man, even those born out of wedlock. This chaotic system practically guaranteed conflict. After all, when multiple sons all believe they have an equal right to rule, how else would you settle it except through war? But the hard-won peace brought revolutionary changes. The Law of Succession of 1260, implemented just 20 years after the Civil Wars ended, established that only the legitimate eldest son of the previous king could inherit the throne. This simple change likely saved countless Norwegian lives in the generations that followed. The Civil Wars also transformed the very nature of Norwegian kingship. The kings who emerged victorious, particularly Harken, who ruled for nearly 50 years after the wars, developed a more centralized authority. Royal power was no longer something to be constantly challenged, but became an institution respected by both nobles and commoners alike. Yet perhaps the most sobering legacy of this bloody era was the stark reminder of how quickly a society can unravel when personal ambition overshadows the common good. Every Norwegian learned this lesson the hard way. When leaders put their own desires for power above the welfare of their people, everyone suffers. Crops are burned, villages destroyed, and ordinary people pay the ultimate price for the ambitions of a few powerful men. Did you know that historians estimate that the population of Norway actually declined during this period? While the rest of Europe was experiencing growth, Norway was losing people to endless conflict. Some villages were burned and abandoned so many times that they simply ceased to exist. But not all legacies of the Civil Wars were grim. The heroic stories that emerged from this chaotic time continue to inspire Norwegians to this day. None more famous than the tale of the Birkebeiner warriors, loyal soldiers who, in 1186, risked everything to save the infant prince Harken. With enemy forces hunting them, these brave men skied across treacherous mountains in the dead of winter, carrying the baby who would one day unite the kingdom and end the civil wars. This dramatic rescue has been immortalized in the Birkebeiner ski race, one of the most challenging cross-country ski marathons in the world. Every year, thousands of skiers recreate this historic journey, carrying a weight representing the infant king. It's a powerful reminder that even in Norway's darkest hour, acts of courage and sacrifice helped forge the path to a better future. The Civil Wars also left their mark on Norwegian literature and art. The saga of King Sverre, composed shortly after his death, remains one of the most compelling works of medieval Norwegian literature. These stories weren't just entertainment. They helped shape a national identity, reminding Norwegians of both the horror of civil conflict and the possibility of redemption. Perhaps the most profound legacy is one that's harder to measure: a deep cultural aversion to internal conflict. After experiencing the devastation of a century of civil war, Norway developed political traditions emphasizing compromise and consensus. You can still see echoes of this today in modern Norwegian politics. So while the Norwegian Civil Wars represent a dark chapter in the country's history, they also mark a crucial turning point, the painful but necessary birth of a more united and stable nation. Sometimes the deepest scars lead to the most important healing. The Norwegian Civil Wars stand as a testament to both the darkest and most inspiring aspects of human nature. For over 100 years, this land of fjords and northern lights became a battlefield where blood was spilled, brothers turned against brothers, and alliances were forged and broken like ice in spring. But what can we learn from this tumultuous chapter of history? Perhaps the most powerful lesson is that power itself is like a double-edged sword. It can build kingdoms or destroy them. The throne that so many fought and died for became both a blessing and a curse for those who sought it. Yet through all the chaos and bloodshed, we discovered that the true strength of Norway lay not in its crown, but in the unity of its people. The story of the Birkebeiner and Bagler, once bitter enemies who finally found common ground, shows us that even the deepest divisions can be healed when people choose peace over power. Their reconciliation wasn't just about ending a war, it was about building a future where differences could be resolved without bloodshed. What do you think about this fascinating period of history? What lessons can we draw from these medieval struggles that still resonate with our world today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on how these ancient conflicts might relate to our modern understanding of power and leadership. If you've enjoyed this journey through one of Norway's most dramatic periods, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. Subscribe to the Medieval Archives and ring that notification bell to join us on more adventures through the fascinating world of medieval history. Until our next historical journey together, I'm your host, and this has been the story of the Norwegian Civil Wars.